The notification arrived on a Tuesday morning, which somehow made it worse. Commander Delegate Thresvon of the Conclave Enforcement Division had chosen Tuesday because, according to its briefing files on human timekeeping, Tuesdays were the most psychologically deflating day of the human week. Not the brutal shock of Monday, not the hope of Wednesday's midpoint. Just Tuesday, gray, unremarkable, a day that existed only to remind you how far away the weekend was. The Conclave's xenopsychology team had spent 11 years compiling that detail. Thresvon found it useful. The notification landed simultaneously in the inboxes of every head of state on Earth, was broadcast on every frequency the Conclave knew humans monitored, and was projected in text 40 meters high on the atmospheric relay drone, stationed 1,800 kilometers above the Indian Ocean. It read, translated from Conclave standard into every human language simultaneously. Notice of Galactic Enforcement, Compassionate Relocation Order 7741 Epsilon. The species known as the Veth Corps, hereafter designated as Displaced Party, have been found in violation of Conclave Charter Section 9, Articles 12 through 44, pertaining to territorial expansion without license, survey, biological contamination of protected star systems, unlicensed resource extraction, and failure to maintain population census documentation with the Conclave Registry Bureau. Under the compassionate relocation provisions of the Charter, the Veth Corps have been divested of all territorial claims and removed from their home system. A convoy of 17 vessels carrying 2.3 million displaced individuals will arrive in proximity to the third planet of your solar system, the only inhabitable world in range that agreed to accept the convoy, within 14 of your standard days. These individuals are now your responsibility. The Conclave thanks you for your cooperation. At the bottom, in slightly smaller text, note, non-compliance with accepted relocation orders is also a violation of Charter Section 9. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom read it 3 times. The President of the United States made a phone call to the Secretary of Defense, who made 17 more phone calls in rapid succession, and then everyone agreed that the most useful thing to do was convene an emergency session of the United Nations General Assembly. This took 4 days. In the remaining 10 days before the convoy arrived, very little of practical value was accomplished, but a great many strongly worded statements were issued, which made everyone feel marginally better. The Veth Corps arrived on a Thursday. 17 vessels, not warships, not colony ships in any configuration humans recognized, but something in between, heavy-bellied transports that moved with a sluggish, exhausted quality that even non-pilots could read as wrong. They entered orbit in a loose cluster, not a formation. No fanfare, no communication. They simply stopped and hung there above the Pacific, and the silence they maintained for the first 6 hours was the loudest thing most people on Earth had ever not heard. Mara Chen was 34 years old, a refugee resettlement coordinator with UNHCR who had spent 9 years working camps in Jordan, Bangladesh, and South Sudan. She had been pulled from a field assignment in Uganda 48 hours earlier and deposited in a hastily organized joint task force whose letterhead read United Nations Emergency Coordination, Extraterrestrial Population Event, which everyone immediately shortened to UNEPE, which everyone immediately began pronouncing as UNEPI, which nobody thought was funny but everyone kept saying anyway. She had been assigned as ground coordinator for what the task force was calling Receiving Zone Gamma, a section of the Australian outback that had been selected based on a combination of available space, proximity to a major port, and the Australian government's characteristically blunt assessment that they had dealt with worse. She was standing at the edge of a temporary processing facility that, 12 days ago, had been empty red desert when the first shuttle came down. It was not what she expected. She had half prepared herself, in the sleepless hours before dawn, for something overwhelming, a warship configuration, a weapon deployment, something that would tell her what frame of mind these people were in. What she got instead was a vessel about the size of a commercial airliner that descended with excruciating slowness, almost trembling, and set down 300 meters from the perimeter with a sound like a building settling after an earthquake. Then nothing happened for 11 minutes. Then a door opened. The Vethkor did not look like movie aliens. This was the first thing Mara registered, in a distant, cataloging part of her mind that kept working even when the rest of her had gone very quiet. They were roughly bipedal, standing between 1.4 and 1.8 meters tall, with 4 arms arranged in 2 pairs. The upper pair longer, used for reach and manipulation, the lower pair shorter, tucked closer to the body, used for what would later turn out to be fine motor work, and in moments of stress, held crossed over the chest in a posture that looked uncannily like human self-comfort. Their skin was a deep blue-gray, textured like weathered stone, and their faces were wide, with large amber eyes that caught light strangely, as if something behind them was always adjusting. They had no external ears. They communicated in part through a layered subsonic register that humans couldn't hear, but could, uncomfortably, feel in their back teeth. The first one down the ramp was a female. The Vethkor had 3 biological sexes, a detail that the xenobiology briefing had noted and then immediately abandoned as too complicated for a summary document. She stopped at the bottom of the ramp and stood very still, looking at the processing facility, at the staff in their lanyards and high-vis vests, at the Australian sky, which was doing what Australian skies do in early afternoon, which is to say blazing at you with a kind of cheerful violence. She looked at Mara. Mara looked back. Then, because this was her job and also because standing in silence seemed like it would only get worse, Mara raised her hand in a small wave, not the large, exuberant wave of someone greeting a long-lost friend. A small, careful one. "Hello, I see you. I'm not going to pretend this isn't strange." The Vethkor female watched her hand for a long moment. Then she made a gesture with her upper right arm, a half-rotation of the wrist, fingers spreading slightly, that the translation team would later spend 3 weeks deciding was the closest Vethkor equivalent to the same thing. They named her Soria because her actual name involved the subsonic register and therefore required vibration-sensitive equipment to reproduce. She didn't seem to mind. She would later explain, through the translation system that the task force assembled over the first chaotic week, that names were less fixed among the Vethkor than among humans. They were more like handles, picked up and set down depending on context, and a name chosen by the people you were living among was considered, in Vethkor custom, a form of welcome. "You named me," she said in the flat, slightly delayed cadence of the translation system during one of the early intake interviews. "This means you intend to know me. This means I am not yet gone." Mara wrote that down. She wrote a lot of things down. The processing went badly, then better, then badly again in a different way. The conclave had sent, along with the convoy, a representative. His name was Arbiter Delegate Kethsal, and he arrived in a separate, significantly cleaner vessel 12 hours after the main convoy, in what was clearly intended as a statement. His ship was white and angular where theirs had been gray and rounded. His uniform was immaculate. He had 6 arms, which was 2 more than any of the Vethkor, a fact that Mara's cultural liaison would later explain was roughly equivalent to showing up to a meeting with a larger car. Kethsal set up in the conference space. The task force had established in the facility's admin block and immediately began issuing documentation requirements. Mara sat across from him and his 2 aides and watched the documentation requirements arrive. Census confirmation for all 2.3 million individuals, biological screening consent forms in conclave standard. He noted, been told humans could be provided translation assistance, though his tone implied this was an indulgence he found unreasonable. Territorial claim disclaimers. confirmation that no Veth Corps would attempt to re-establish prior territorial claims, biometric registration packets, and a 47-page acknowledgement form confirming that the receiving world understood its obligations under the compassionate relocation provisions of the Charter. "We haven't signed the Charter," said the UN legal advisor sitting to Mara's left, whose name was Priya Subramaniam, and who had the specific quality of stillness that comes from having said very difficult things to very powerful people many times and having survived it. Kethsal looked at her. He had large eyes like the Veth Corps, but where theirs were amber and somehow warm despite their strangeness, his were a pale silver that caught the fluorescent light of the room and bounced it back as something colder. "Correct," he said. "You have not signed the Charter. You are not a conclave member. You are, in fact, an uncontacted world under provisional observation status, which means you have no standing to refuse a compassionate relocation order, no standing to negotiate its terms, and no standing to lodge a formal objection. What you have is the option to comply gracefully or to have compliance noted in your observation file as having required significant prompting, which will affect your eventual membership assessment timeline." There was a pause. "I see," said Priya. She wrote something on her notepad. "Could you clarify the timeline for that membership assessment?" "Between 200 and 800 of your standard years, depending on the rate of civilizational development. And in the meantime, we are simply expected to process the displaced party." "Yes." Kethsal folded 2 of his arms and moved the other 4 in a brief gesture that his aide leaned over and murmured the translation of into Mara's earpiece. A dismissal, roughly equivalent to case closed. "I will remain in system for 40 standard days to ensure compliance is proceeding. If there are specific logistical questions of a procedural nature, my office can be reached through the relay frequency assigned in your notification package." He then stood and walked out, and the meeting ended without him having asked a single question about whether any of the 2.3 million Veth Corps arriving on Earth's doorstep needed food or water or medical attention. Mara looked at the documentation packet. It was, she estimated, about 400 pages when printed. Then she looked at the window, through which she could see the processing yard, where the first 300 Veth Corps to disembark were standing in loose groups, looking at everything with the wide, careful eyes of people who have learned to hold very still in unfamiliar places, because stillness is safer than movement when you don't know the rules yet. A child, she could tell, because it was smaller, and because a larger Veth Corps was holding its lower set of arms in both of hers, pressed against its mother's side, and stared at the sky with an expression that needed no translation at all. Mara set the documentation packet to one side. "All right," she said. "Let's figure out what they actually need." What they actually needed was a great many things, delivered urgently and simultaneously, and the following 3 weeks were the kind of weeks that Mara would later have difficulty describing to anyone who hadn't been in them. Not because they were indescribable, but because the description always came out sounding either more catastrophic or more triumphant than it had actually felt from the inside. Which was mostly just one problem following another at a pace that didn't allow for either catastrophe or triumph, only the next problem. The Veth Corps needed water, but not the same mineral composition as human water. Or rather, they could tolerate human water, but too much of it in too short a time caused a kind of cellular inflammation that presented, to the task force's medical team, as something disturbingly close to systemic shock. Dr. James Ockhaffer, the team's lead xenobiologist, identified this on day 3 and spent the next 48 hours working with 2 Veth Corps who had medical training. They had medical training. They had engineers and teachers and musicians and historians and people who had been farmers of crops that no longer existed on worlds that no longer belonged to them, to establish what the correct filtration adjustment should be. They needed caloric intake, but the Veth Corps digestive system processed certain carbon compounds differently than humans did, and until the correct dietary profile was established, the food aid arriving from global emergency stockpiles was being sorted by VethCorps volunteers into piles of yes, maybe, and absolutely not. The absolutely not pile being identifiable by the way the sorters stepped back from it and made a gesture that everyone eventually agreed meant something like that would kill me. They needed shelter, and the temporary facilities were insufficient, and the permanent housing solution was going to take months. And in the meantime, the Australian winter was technically mild by global standards, but the VethCorps had evolved on a world with a narrower temperature range, and found anything below 15 degrees Celsius physically distressing in a way that manifested as a kind of helpless shivering that was very hard to watch. And they needed, underneath all the logistics, something that the task force's intake forms didn't have a field for. Mara noticed it first in Soria, who had been assigned as a community liaison for the first disembarked group, and who Mara therefore saw every day. There was a quality in how Soria held herself, in how most of them held themselves, that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite exhaustion, though it contained all three. It was the quality of people who had been told, authoritatively, by a power they couldn't fight, that they were the problem, that their existence was the violation, that their removal was not a punishment but a courtesy, as the notification had taken care to specify compassionate relocation, and that the compassion was the conclave's, not their own, and they should be grateful for it. On day 9, Mara was in the processing yard when one of the VethCorps men, she had started to learn names, or at least the translation system versions of them, sat down on the ground in the middle of the yard and simply stopped moving. Not collapse, not illness, just a total cessation, like a machine reaching the end of a programmed sequence. His name was Darren Howe in the translation system. He had been an archivist. He had maintained the VethCorps historical record, 40,000 years of it, on servers that were now in a system that no longer belonged to his people, and which, under the terms of the relocation order, they had no right to access. She sat down next to him on the red dirt. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't be smaller than what he was carrying. After a long time, he said, through the translation system, "They told us we were a problem. The problem has been resolved. What am I now?" Mara thought about that. She thought about the intake forms. She thought about Kethsal in his clean uniform with his dismissal gestures. She thought about the notification on a Tuesday morning. "You're here," she said. "That's not nothing." It wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough. But Darren Howe looked at her and then looked at his hands and then, slowly, unfolded himself from the ground. On day 22, Kethsal called a compliance review meeting. He arrived with 3 aides and an updated documentation packet, and took his seat with the precise, architectural confidence of someone who had never once considered that a meeting might not go the way he expected. The task force sent Mara, Priya, Dr. Akafer, and a political officer named Marcus Webb, who had previously worked UN Security Council affairs, and who had a gift for sitting very quietly and letting silences become someone else's problem. "Census registration," said Kethsal, placing a data chip on the table, "stands at 34% compliance. Required level for provisional documentation clearance is 95%. You are behind schedule." "Yes," said Priya, "we're working on it." "The compliance timeline is not flexible. The documentation must be filed with the Registry Bureau within the relocation window." "We understand. We're also managing immediate medical needs for approximately 400 individuals who arrived in a state of significant nutritional deficiency, a water supply adjustment that took 10 days to calibrate, an outbreak of what our medical team has provisionally identified as a stress response immune condition, affecting roughly 12% of the population, and a shelter shortage that we're currently addressing with emergency construction on 3 continents. The census forms are being processed as fast as they can be processed." Kethsal looked at her, then he looked at the data chip, then he looked at Mara. "I am told," he said, "that you have diverted receiving area staff from documentation processing to what your task force is calling welfare activities." "Yes," said Mara. "Documentation compliance is the condition under which the conclave will recognize the legality of the relocation." "Yes, and people were sick." "The medical condition of the displaced party is not a conclave concern once the relocation is." "It's our concern," said Mara. She hadn't planned to say it. It arrived in her mouth fully formed with the weight of the previous 22 days behind it. "It's our concern because they're here and we don't do it the way you do. We don't mark a form complete and move on to the next case. They're people. Their kids have names. We're going to take care of them, and we're going to fill out your forms. And if the forms take a little longer because we were also making sure no one froze to death or went into shock, then that's how it goes." The room was quiet. Marcus Webb, who had been sitting very quietly in the corner, said absolutely nothing and managed to make this feel supportive. Quetzal looked at Mara for a long moment. His silver eyes moved to her face and stayed there with an evaluative quality, like a measurement being taken. She had the sudden, vertiginous sense that she was being assessed against some stored categorization in his briefing materials, and that whatever category she was landing in was not the one he had prepared for. "You are the ground coordinator," he said, as if confirming this to himself. "Yes. Your civilization has not yet achieved conclave entry criteria. Your technology is pre-interstellar. Your governance structures are," he paused, "fragmented." "Reasonably accurate," said Mara. "And yet you are telling me," he said carefully, like a being working through a translation error, "that you will do this your way." "Yes." Quetzal picked up the data chip. He stood. He looked at her for one more moment and then, almost involuntarily, she would have sworn it was involuntary, one of his 6 arms made a small movement, not the dismissal gesture, something she hadn't seen from him before. His aide didn't translate it and she didn't ask. He left. The meeting technically was over. Priya wrote something on her notepad. Dr. Akaffer let out a breath he appeared to have been holding for some time. Marcus Webb still said nothing, but he nodded once, which for Marcus Webb was roughly equivalent to a standing ovation. The documentation reached 96% by day 38. It reached that number because, on day 25, something shifted in the Vethkor community's relationship to the process. Mara couldn't point to a single cause. It wasn't a speech or a meeting or an announcement. It was smaller than that, the accumulation of small things that don't register individually but change the atmosphere of a place by increment. It was the water working correctly on day 10. It was the dietary profile being solved on day 14, after which the food aid actually helped rather than requiring constant sorting, and Vethkor, who had been slowly declining, began, slowly, to stabilize. It was Dr. Akaffer on day 17 sitting down with the 2 Vethkor medical practitioners, Heen Val, and a younger one who had been a student before the relocation, still learning, and working through the immune response data together, not as lead physician and consultants, but as 3 people with the same problem and different pieces of the answer. It was the school, improvised in a large equipment tent on day 19, where 3 Vethkor teachers began holding sessions, and the human staff found reasons to walk past it frequently just to hear the sound of children making noise in a key they couldn't parse, but which was recognizably the key of children being taught things. It was Mara, on day 20, bringing Darren Howe to the facility's IT section and sitting with him for 4 hours while he and 2 of the tech staff attempted to work out whether there was any technically not in violation of the relocation order method, by which some portion of the historical archive could be transmitted before the access window closed. They did not succeed in that session. They did succeed 3 days later, when Darren Howe came back with a Vethkor engineer named Pethra who had worked in communications, and between the 4 of them, they found an approach that fit inside a technical loophole in the Charter's data transmission provisions. Not a loophole that any of them were certain the conclave would accept, but one that Priya reviewed and said, with the specific careful intonation of a lawyer choosing her words, "I cannot advise that this is clearly prohibited." They transmitted 40% of the archive. Not everything. 40% was not everything. But Darren Howe sat at the terminal after the transmission confirmed and was very still for a moment. And then he made a sound that the translation system rendered as text in Mara's earpiece. Not a word, just a notation. Vocal expression indicating emotional release, classification. Grief adjacent, hope adjacent, no direct translation available. She left him alone with it. Some things didn't need company. Kethsal came back on day 36 for what he called a final compliance assessment. He brought different aides this time. The facility had changed since his first visit. There were more structures, more people moving between them with the purposeful quality of a place that has found its rhythm. More Veth Corps working alongside human staff in ways that had evolved organically over the weeks. The kind of working together that happens when two groups of people share a problem long enough that the distinction between whose problem it is stops being useful. The yard where the first shuttle had landed was still red dirt, but someone had put down a section of artificial turf from a sporting goods emergency donation, and a group of Veth Corps children were doing something on it that involved a lot of running and a ball made from packing material and rules that appeared to be negotiated in real time and didn't particularly resemble any human game Mara could identify. Kethsal stopped when he saw that. He stood at the edge of the yard, aides behind him, and watched the children play for a long moment. Mara, who had been walking him from the arrival point, stopped beside him and waited. "They are playing," he said. It was not a question, but it had the inflection of something that needed to be verified. "Yes." "The stress response immune condition, you said 12%. We got it down to 3. The cases that remain are mostly elderly. Dr. Akafer's team is working on it." She paused. "They respond better to this, being somewhere that feels like a place instead of a transit point. It helps." Kethsal watched the children for another moment. Then one of them, a small one, the one Mara had learned was named Heli in the translation system, because the child had looked at Mara one day and said something the system translated as "I am the one who runs fastest," and Mara had said okay. "Then you're Heli," and the child had seemed to find this extremely satisfying. Ran directly across the field of play, scooped up the ball, ran directly back, and was immediately pursued by 4 others making sounds that, while not human laughter, were in the same general conceptual space. Something happened in Kethsal's face. It was small. Mara would have missed it if she hadn't spent 3 weeks learning to read a species by their smallest movements, because their biggest ones were often the least informative. His lower 2 arms shifted, crossed in front of his body, then uncrossed, then settled at his sides. "The census documentation," he said, turning away from the yard. "You said 96%. The remaining 4% are cases where there are documentation complications, people who lost identification records in the relocation process. We're verifying identity through community testimony. It's a process we use for human refugees in similar situations. It will take another 3 weeks. The Conclave's Registry Bureau requires the documentation to be complete before. We know what it requires. We're doing it the right way, which sometimes takes a little longer than the required way. We'll have the remaining 4% within 3 weeks. If the Bureau has a problem with that timeline, they can submit a formal objection through whatever channel is appropriate for objecting to things done by a world that isn't a Conclave member yet." Kethsal looked at her. The silver eyes did that measuring thing again. "Yet," he said. "We figure we've got about 200 years, said Mara. "Plenty of time." Another small silence. Then Kethsal said, in a tone that his aides didn't translate and didn't seem to expect to translate, You said yet. I did. Previous uncontacted worlds, when informed of the membership timeline, have generally not responded with the assumption that membership was a direction of travel. Mara thought about that. We're optimists, she said. It's a flaw. We know. Quetzal was quiet for a moment longer. Then he said, there are additional matters I was sent to assess: behavioral integration of the displaced party, incidents of conflict incidents, resource allocation compliance. He paused. I have read your task force's weekly reports. I am prepared to mark those assessments as satisfactory without further review if you are willing to walk me through the current facility layout. Myra looked at him. You want a tour? I want to complete the required assessment in an efficient manner. Right, said Mara, sure. Come on. She showed him the medical tent first, where Dr. Akafer's team was running a morning clinic that had, over the weeks, become a mixed operation. Human doctors and nurses working alongside Heen Vao and her student, and 2 other Veth Corps who had turned out to have medical training. The whole arrangement driven by the pragmatic fact that 2.3 million patients was too many for either group alone, and the Veth Corps practitioners had useful knowledge about Veth Corps physiology that no human had yet. She showed him the education tent, where the school had expanded into 2 sessions, a morning one for children and an afternoon one that had, without anyone exactly planning it, become a mutual language class. Veth Corps learning English and various other human languages, humans learning the portions of Veth Corps that were audible to human ears. With the subsonic elements being represented by a notation system that one of the Veth Corps teachers and one of the human linguistics staff had invented together over the course of a long, apparently very intense afternoon 2 weeks earlier. She showed him the workshop space, which had started as a tool storage area and had become something else entirely when it turned out that the Veth Corps included a significant number of people who worked with their hands and found the idleness of the early weeks unbearable. It was crowded now, full of a combination of human and Veth Corps tools and projects at various stages of completion. Some of them repair work for the facility itself, some of them things whose purpose Mara didn't always understand, but which were clearly being made with great care. On a shelf near the door, someone had placed a row of small objects, things made from the packing material and wire and off-cut wood of the facility, not exactly sculptures and not exactly tools, somewhere in between. They were unmistakably Veth Corps in aesthetic and unmistakably made in this place, on this world in these weeks. She didn't know who had put them on the shelf. She suspected it had started with one and others had followed. Quetzal stopped in front of the shelf. He looked at the objects for a long time. These are not in your task force's reports, he said. No, said Mara. Why not? She thought about how to say it. Because I didn't know how to categorize them. Integration activity, cultural expression, community development, she shook her head. I just left it off. Some things don't fit in the boxes. Quetzal picked up one of the objects. He turned it over in 2 of his hands. It was an irregular shape, suggesting something organic, a seed pod, maybe, or a coiled thing mid-motion. It had been made carefully from salvaged materials, but it was unmistakably beautiful in the quiet way that things made with attention are beautiful. On the 3 previous worlds where the Conclave has administered compassionate relocation, said Quetzal, the displaced party required ongoing enforcement support for an average of 11 standard years before integration was considered viable. Mara looked at him. We've been here 36 days. Yes, he set the object down. He didn't look at her. I am aware. She waited. I will file my assessment, he said, and note that compliance documentation is proceeding within acceptable bounds and that welfare indicators are within satisfactory range. He paused. I will also note certain anomalous elements of the receiving world's approach that may warrant further study. Anomalous, said Mara. "You are working with them," said Quetzal. "Not for them, not above them, with them." He seemed to be finding language for something that didn't have language in whatever framework he'd arrived with. "This is not the standard receiving world profile." "We've had a lot of practice," said Mara. "Not with aliens, with each other. We're not good at it. We make a lot of mistakes, but we've been doing it for a long time." Quetzal was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Conclave did not expect this outcome." "What outcome did they expect?" He turned and looked at her directly. "Resistance, resentment, or helpless compliance, doing the minimum required because there was no option to refuse. Either response would have been manageable." He paused. "This is not manageable. This is something else." Mara smiled just slightly. "We're complicated," she said, "also a flaw." He left the following day, 12 days before the end of his official assessment window, without explanation. His official assessment file was filed with the Registry Bureau 24 hours later. Priya received a copy through the task force's liaison channel and read it twice before calling Mara. He recommended a re-evaluation of Earth's provisional observation status, said Priya. He's suggesting the Conclave reconsider the 200 to 800-year membership timeline. Mara was standing in the processing yard when she took the call. The afternoon light was long and amber, the kind of light that makes the red dirt look like it's lit from underneath. Somewhere in the education tent, the afternoon language session was happening, and she could hear, just barely, the sound of a room full of people attempting to say things in each other's languages, and mostly getting it wrong in ways that were, from the sound of it, extremely funny to everyone present. "On what grounds?" she said. He cited several factors. "I'll send you the full document." Priya paused. The last line specifically says, "I'm going to read this exactly. The receiving world's integration approach demonstrates a quality of civilizational character not captured by current conclave assessment criteria, and criteria may require revision." Mara looked at the yard. Darren Howe was crossing it in the direction of the IT section. He walked differently now than he had on day 9, not unburdened, not repaired, but moving with a sense of somewhere to be. He saw her and raised his upper right arm in a half rotation of the wrist, fingers spreading slightly. She raised her hand in a small wave. "What do we do with that?" said Priya. "Nothing," said Mara. "Keep going. We've got 4% of census documentation still to process, and about 2,000 people in the Nairobi zone who arrived with basically nothing and need winter gear in the next 3 weeks." She paused. "And someone needs to talk to the workshop about expanding into the adjacent space because they're out of room." "That's it." "That's it." She pocketed the phone. The long light moved across the yard. The school tent was quiet for a moment, and then, distinctly, someone made a sound, human or Vethkor she couldn't tell, that was recognizably laughter. The kind that happens when you're trying to pronounce something, and you get it very wrong and everyone around you finds this enormous. And you find it too because the wrongness of it is also the rightness of the moment. Because you were trying, because you are here. Because this is actually happening, and it is strange and difficult and somehow, beneath all of it. It is happening. The formal integration report, filed 8 months later by the UNEPE task force with the relevant international bodies, ran to 312 pages and covered, in exhaustive detail, the logistical, medical, legal, infrastructural, diplomatic, and humanitarian dimensions of receiving 2.3 million displaced extraterrestrial individuals into Earth's existing systems. It addressed resource allocation across 47 receiving zones on 6 continents. It documented the development of 17 new dietary protocols, 3 new medical treatment frameworks, and 2 new frameworks for identity verification that subsequent refugee organizations would later adapt for human cases. It addressed the legal status question at length, in terms that Priya considered inadequate to the actual complexity, and that a subsequent international working group would spend 2 years improving. It was a thorough document. It was also, in the way of thorough documents, somewhat insufficient. It did not capture Heli running across a field of red dirt with a ball made of packing material. It did not capture Darren Howe at a terminal at 2 in the morning, receiving the confirmation that 40% of 40,000 years of record had been saved, and the sound he made. It did not capture Dr. Akafer and Heenvau's students sitting on the steps of the medical tent at the end of a long shift, comparing, in two imperfectly overlapping languages, the human and Veth core words for tired, and finding that the Veth core word contained, in its subsonic register, a meaning that translated only approximately as tired in a way that means you did something. It did not capture the shelf of small objects in the workshop, which continued to grow until it needed a second shelf and then a third, until someone with an eye for these things arranged a selection of them in the facility's common space and wrote a small label that said, in English and in Veth core notation, "Made here." It did not capture what Soria said to Mara on the day the last census documentation was filed complete, which was, "Your people knew us before you knew us. You treated us as known before we had proven we should be." And Mara said, "You didn't need to prove it, that's not how it works here." And Soria said, "The conclave would not agree." And Mara said, "The conclave isn't here." Word reached them on day 41 that a second relocation convoy was in transit. Not Veth core this time. A different species entirely, designation in conclave, standard that the translation system rendered as Orth dim, a word that the linguists would later note carried in its standard pronunciation, a subtle tonal quality suggesting something that had been reduced, not a scientific term, but a cultural one, baked into the naming the way some old human words carried their history in their bones. The Orithdim were aquatic, or had been, on a world with 3 times the ocean coverage of Earth, before a conclave survey found trace quantities of a mineral compound in their tidal system that was worth more than their civilization's assessed economic contribution to the galactic register. The survey had been licensed. The relocation had been compassionate. There were 400,000 of them. The notification, this time, arrived on a Wednesday. Someone in the conclave xenopsychology team was improvising. Mara was in Geneva when she got it. She had been there for a week for a task force debrief that was, she suspected, going to become a regular feature of her life. And she read it on her phone in the corridor outside the meeting room and then went back in and sat down and waited for the current speaker to finish his point about documentation standardization, and then said, into a brief silence, "We're going to need to plan for a second intake." The room absorbed this. Then the Australian delegate, who had been at the first intake from day 4, and who had a particular way of looking at extraordinary things as if they were simply additional items on a list, said, "Aquatic." "Aquatic." He wrote something down. "We're going to need to talk to the oceanographic people, and probably the Netherlands." "And probably the Netherlands," Mara agreed. The meeting continued. The debrief was rescheduled. Priya drafted 14 new legal memos in the following week, most of them revolving around the phrase "our previous situation was unprecedented. So here is why this one is different." And what was interesting was that this was true. Each situation was genuinely different, which meant that the approaches built for the first couldn't simply be copied for the second. But the approach underneath the approaches, the thing that had made the first work, could travel. The approach underneath the approaches was, start with the person in front of you. It sounded simple. It turned out to be the hardest thing to do consistently at scale, harder than the logistics and harder than the diplomacy and harder than Keth saw with his documentation requirements. The logistics had solutions. The diplomacy had protocols. Doing it at scale meant doing it in the moments when you were exhausted and the forms were late and the resource request had been denied for the 3rd time, and the person in front of you was the 237th person in front of you that day, and you had to find still The thing in you that saw them as the first person rather than the 237th. Mara was not always good at this. She had bad days. Everyone on the task force had bad days, which was maybe the most useful thing about working in a team. On the days when you couldn't find it, someone else could carry it for a while. She thought about this sometimes when she was being asked, by journalists or policy advisors, or increasingly by delegations from other governments who wanted to understand what the task force had done and how, because the results had become difficult to ignore. What's the method? What's the framework? What are the replicable processes? And the replicable processes existed, and she would describe them, and they were genuinely useful, and they were also not quite the thing. The thing was harder to describe. The thing was closer to. We decided it mattered, and then every day we decided again. She went back to the Australian facility in the second month. Not for a task force reason. There were task force reasons she could have used, but she went for her own reasons, which she didn't examine too closely. The facility had changed again. It kept changing. She thought it would always keep changing, because that was what places did when people lived in them and cared about them. And the Vethcore community had in 8 months very clearly made the decision to care about this place, perhaps because this place had first cared about them. The processing yard had been the first thing to change, back in the early weeks. Now the changes were deeper. There were gardens, not gardens in the way Mara had grown up with, raised beds and familiar crops, but something between a garden and something else, growing things in arrangements that followed a Vethcore aesthetic logic that she was slowly learning to read, tended by people who had been farmers on their own world and who were working out, carefully and with a great deal of experimentation, what this world could grow and what they could help it grow. A human botanist from the CSIRO had been out 3 times in the past month. There were, apparently, some interesting results. The school was a building now. Not a tent, an actual building, constructed in collaboration between a Vethcore work crew who had done construction on their home world and a local building firm that had initially been contracted for something straightforward, and had ended up in a 6-month design conversation that neither party fully understood, but both found extremely productive. The building had features that weren't in any human architectural reference, proportions and angles, and a specific treatment of the entrance that the Vethcore construction lead had explained at length to the human architect, something about how the transition from outside to inside should feel, the way thresholds carry meaning. The building worked for both species. It looked like nothing Mara had seen before. It looked right. Darren Howe found her in the late afternoon, sitting on a low wall near the workshop, watching the light change. He sat beside her. He had been working on the archive. He was always working on the archive. The CSIRO people, he said, the plant researchers, they want to publish something about what we're growing together. What did you tell them? That we would like to be named as co-authors. He paused. This seemed to surprise them. It shouldn't, said Mara. It's your knowledge. It is knowledge from a world that no longer belongs to us, said Darren Howe quietly. We are not sure what it belongs to now. Perhaps it belongs to wherever we use it. Perhaps it belongs to whoever continues it. Mara thought about that for a while. You know, she said, 40% of the archive is a lot. People work with a lot less. We work with what we have, said Darren Howe. He looked at the garden, at the strange, not quite human plants catching the amber afternoon. We are making new things from the old things. This is not the same as having the old things, but it is something. He said it the way people say things they have decided to believe, firmly, because the decision is the thing, because the alternative to the decision is not a choice but an absence, and absence is not available. Made here, said Mara. Made here, said Darren Howe. The diplomatic meeting happened 14 months after the first notification. They held it in Geneva, in the UN building that had the big assembly hall. Though the assembly hall had been reconfigured, because standard seating arrangements assumed everyone present was approximately the same shape, and there were 4 Veth Corps representatives in the delegation, and a modified seating layout was respectful rather than optional. The conclave sent 3 delegates, which was 1 fewer than the human delegation had expected, and which Priya spent 2 hours trying to determine the diplomatic significance of, before concluding that it might simply mean they'd sent 3. Quetzal was one of them. He arrived, as before, immaculate. 6 arms, pale silver eyes, the precise, architectural posture of someone trained from early life to take up a specific amount of space. He looked around the reconfigured room with an expression that Mara, who had gotten better at reading him, identified as something more than assessment. He looked at the Veth Corps representatives. They looked at him. Whatever passed between them was not translatable, but it lasted several seconds and involved stillness from all parties, which Mara had come to understand was a form of acknowledgement, a way of saying I see you without requiring words for what I see you as. The formal dialogue was exactly as complicated as Priya had predicted, and exactly as unconcluded as Priya had predicted, and also, in ways that surprised everyone including Priya, occasionally something else. There was an afternoon session on charter provisions affecting non-member worlds that became, somehow, an actual exchange of views. The conclave delegates presenting the charter framework and the Earth delegation responding not just with objections but with questions, genuine ones, about the principles behind the provisions and whether those principles held up when tested against the Veth Corps case specifically, and several hypothetical cases that the legal team had prepared and which turned out to be not entirely hypothetical to the conclave delegates, who had, it emerged, encountered versions of them before. Quetzal sat across from Mara during the afternoon break, in the corridor outside the main hall. He had a cup of something from the catering station. He'd been offered it and taken it, and appeared to be experimenting with it in small, careful sips. "It's tea," said Mara. "If it tastes like very hot leaf water, that's working as intended." "It tastes," said Quetzal, "like a very specific kind of warmth that comes from something being steeped for longer than necessary." He held the cup with 2 of his arms. The other 4 were relaxed at his sides, which she had learned was the conclave equivalent of ease, though the phrasing he had used for it once was more accurate, not performing ease. This is either a flaw in the preparation or a preference. "Both usually," said Mara. He was quiet for a moment. "The Veth Corps representatives," he said, "they brought documents." "Yes." "Their community charter, the new archive organization's founding papers. Darren Howe wrote most of it." "I know his name from your task force reports," said Quetzal. "The archivist. He's building something, they all are." She looked at the tea in her own cup. "The conclave designated them a displaced party. We designated them neighbors. Those turn out to be different things to build toward." Quetzal was still for a moment. "You designated them neighbors," he said slowly, as if checking the word against its meaning, "before you knew them." "Before we knew them well," said Mara. "We knew enough. We knew they were here, and that here is a place where we try to know our neighbors." She paused. "We're imperfect at it, ask anyone, but we try." Quetzal looked at his cup of tea. He made a small gesture with one hand, not one she recognized from the early weeks, not the dismissal or the closed case or the posture that meant his superior position in a hierarchy. Something quieter, something personal. "When I filed the assessment," he said, "the recommendation to revise Earth's status, my supervisors questioned my reasoning. They asked whether the receiving world had deployed some form of influence technique, some cultural leverage that produced the outcome. They did not understand how the outcome was possible through ordinary means." "What did you tell them?" "I told them," said Quetzal, "that humans do not appear to have ordinary means. That their approach to the situation was, by the metrics the conclave uses to evaluate civilizational maturity, inconsistent with their technological and administrative development level, that they behaved as if they already knew what most civilizations take centuries of conclave membership to learn. What's that? He looked at her. That the administrative category is not the person, that the form and the individual it describes are not the same thing, and the form serves the individual, not the reverse. He paused. This is a principle in the Charter. Article 2. Most conclave member worlds learn to cite it. Few appear to have internalized it before they arrive. Mara looked at him for a moment. We've had a lot of practice internalizing things the hard way, she said. Centuries of it, we're still practicing. We get it wrong constantly. Yes, said Quetzal. I noted that in my supplementary assessment as well. Your civilization has a substantial record of failures of exactly this principle. Large ones, ongoing ones. He paused. And yet, said Mara. Someone came to the door of the corridor to indicate the afternoon session was resuming. Quetzal set down his cup and stood, and Mara stood with him, and they walked back into the hall where the Veth Corps representatives were already seated, and Darren Howe was placing a physical copy of the archive founding document on the table in front of him, smoothing it with his lower hands in a gesture so careful it was almost devotional. The session resumed. Outside, the Geneva afternoon continued its business. Somewhere over the horizon, 14 months of incremental, imperfect, stubbornly continued work sat in files and buildings and gardens, and the memories of 2.3 million people who had arrived with nothing and were, slowly, building something. The meeting wasn't finished. It would not be finished today. It might not be finished for a generation. But it was happening. It had become something that was happening, which was the only place anything ever started. 3 years later, a conclave diplomatic vessel entered the solar system with a formal notice. Not a notification this time, not a directive in 40-meter text above the Indian Ocean, but a notice, which was apparently a different category of document, one that used different language and carried different weight. The notice informed Earth that the conclave was, after review, revising the provisional observation status of the third planet of Sol system from uncontacted world to emerging civilization with provisional dialogue status, a category that had apparently not been used in current conclave administrative practice for over 400 standard years. It also noted, in an appendix, that the 2.3 million Veth Corps individuals currently residing on Earth had been granted a status update under the compassionate relocation provisions, from displaced party to provisional diaspora community with recognized cultural preservation rights, effective immediately. The appendix was signed by Arbiter Delegate Quetzal, Conclave Enforcement Division, who had apparently requested assignment to the Earth file. Mara read the notice in her office in the UNEPE's newly established permanent headquarters in Geneva, which had a window that looked out over the lake, and which also had, on the windowsill, one of the small objects from the original workshop, given to her by Pethra on the day she left the Australian facility. She had asked what it was, and Pethra had said, "The translation system renders it as a made thing, but it's more than that. It is a thing that says I was here and I made something. It is a thing that says I intend to continue." She read the notice. She looked at the small object on the windowsill. Then she called Priya. "Did you read it?" said Priya. "Yes." "The dialogue status means they have to actually talk to us. As, and I'm reading from the definition, a recognized emerging civilization withstanding to participate in formal conclave processes at the provisional observer level." Priya's voice had a quality that Mara had rarely heard from her, which was a barely contained incredulity that things had turned out this way. "Mara, they changed an administrative category they hadn't used in 400 years. I know. Because of what we did. Because of what we all did," she paused, "including them." Priya was quiet for a moment. There's going to be a meeting, conclave representatives and an Earth delegation, preliminary dialogue. They're proposing it happen here on Earth, in a location of our choosing. Of course they are, said Mara. It's our turn to host. She hung up. Outside the window, the lake was doing what the lake did in late afternoon, which was turn the particular shade of silver green that made it look like a surface not quite of this world, and which she had stopped noticing until she started paying attention to how Vethcore eyes caught light and found herself looking at light differently afterward. Somewhere in the city, in the new neighborhood that had formed organically around the processing center that had been established in the city's eastern district. Because wherever people are, neighborhoods form, and wherever neighborhoods form, things get named and claimed and made into places. Darren Howe was, at this moment, probably in the converted warehouse that had become the Vethcore Cultural Archive's first physical location outside their home system, working on what they had, building what they could, keeping 40,000 years alive, in whatever form they could keep it. Helly would be by now running somewhere. She was always running. Mara thought about what Kethsal had said. This is not manageable. This is something else. Yes, she thought, we know. We've always been something else. We just don't always remember it until someone from outside comes along and points it out, and then we look at each other and say, oh, right, that. She looked at the small object on the windowsill, the made thing. The eye was here. The eye intend to continue. Outside, the light changed. Evening coming, slow and lateral, the way it does when the year is turning and you've made it through another one. She sat with it for a while before there was another call to take, another problem to untangle, another day's worth of work still left in the file open on her desk. She sat with it, and then she picked up the phone, and then she continued. That was the thing about this job, about this species, about this particular Tuesday that had improbably led here. You continued. That was the trick, not the grand gesture, not the declaration, not the speech. You just kept going, kept treating the next person in front of you as a person, kept finding the loophole in the charter and the right filtration adjustment, and the shelf for the small made things, kept doing it badly and then better and then badly again in a new way. And somehow, incrementally, improbably, against the stated administrative preferences of an interstellar governing body that had not updated a certain category in 400 years. You got somewhere. They all did, together. That was the whole of it, and it was enough.